When you spend 9 or more mana on a creature in Magic the Gathering, you better get something amazing. This is because 9 plus mana typically takes quite a while to produce, or at the very least takes a whole lot of effort. This means creatures that cost 9 or more mana have the massive downside of getting stuck in your hand sometimes, but most of them are so good that they offset that downside. A few weeks ago, I looked at the game's best 9 mana creatures, and we certainly saw some absolute powerhouses. However, not all of Magic's super expensive creatures live up to the mana cost they demand from you. And those are the exact kind of cards we're going to take a look at in this video. Creatures that cost 9 or more mana that aren't worth and have never been worth playing in 40 card, 60 card, or 100 card formats. In other words, these are my picks for the worst 9 plus mana creatures in Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, it's Stratodon. It's an absolutely miserable 10 generic mana for a 5/5 Trampler, but it does cost 1 generic mana less for each basic land type among lands you control. Problem is, you need to have a basic land of every type for the investment here to ever be remotely worth it, and the maximum upside you can get out of this is a 5 mana, 5/5 Trampler. You're going to feel beyond disappointed when that's the case. If you're that good at getting the maximum 5 types in play, there are literally hundreds of better things you could be doing with your impressive mana base, and once you think about how horrendous this is when you stumble on your mana at all, you'll recognize that this is a truly terrible card. So, how is it only number 10? Well, because unlike every other card in this list, it doesn't always cost 9 or more mana. It's probably safe to say that it also has the most underwhelming body of any card on the list, but being able to reduce mana cost is just a massive upgrade when everything else on the list is stuck in your hand forever. At number 9, it's Suncrusher, another massively expensive creature that likes 5-color decks. For 9 generic mana, it's a 3/3 with Sunburst, which means it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana that was spent to cast it. It also has 2 activated abilities. You can pay 4 generic, tap it, and remove one of the counters to destroy a creature, or you can pay 2 generic and remove a counter from it to return the Crusher to your hand. There's some big potential here to be sure. Having a way to kill creatures more than once is pretty great, but like Stratodon, this demands massive setup, and the ceiling in this case is a 9 mana 8/8 that is super clunky and slow, because both of its abilities are pretty expensive for what they are. You have to hope this thing survives to your next turn for the destroy effect to matter, and oftentimes it just won't do enough, especially if your opponents are playing out some real cards at the stage of the game during which Suncrusher is able to come into play. It is kind of nice that the second ability can protect the Suncrusher, but having 2 generic up after casting this is going to be a tall order, and making yourself cast a 9 mana card all over again normally isn't what you want to be doing in a game of Magic anyway. Overall, this asks you to jump through some serious hoops. You need lots of mana, you need it to survive an entire turn for it to do something, and you need mana of all 5 colors to really make it worthwhile at all, and your ultimate reward for managing to make all those things happen is an understated creature who can very slowly kill some stuff if you're lucky. Yeah, that's not worth spending 9 mana on. Speaking of Suncrusher, I want to take a moment to ask you to absolutely crush that subscribe button. I'm closing in on 100,000 subscribers, and I'd like to meet that milestone this year, so I'd really appreciate you helping me get there. At number 8, it's Zodiac Dragon. For 7 generic and 2 red, it's an 8/8, way too small for that amount of mana, so it better have upside, and I have good news for you. It does. When it dies, you can return it to your hand. It's kind of like Suncrusher though. How exciting is it really that you return this thing to your hand? Not very. You have to fork over a ton of mana again, and you get what is just a vanilla creature when it's on the battlefield. It can be chump blocked forever and doesn't have any other effect that makes an impact on the game. So how is it only number 8? Well, because unlike the other cards in this list, this can combo. If you played alongside effects that let you put creatures into play temporarily and give them haste, and then you sacrifice them at the end of the turn, you can do some interesting stuff. The most notable version of this is Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack is particularly nice with it, since it's easy to spend 1 red every turn to put the dragon onto the battlefield and attack with it, and then get it back and do it all over again. This combo is fun, but it's not really that good. Sure, sending this at your opponent every turn is cool, but it can still be easily chump blocked and largely ignored in many situations. There are hundreds of better creatures to put into play with Sneak Attack and similar effects, and this one is terrible when you can't disassemble your combo, and that's really not where you want to be. At number 7, it's Body of Jukai. For 7 generic and 2 green, it's an 8/5 with Trample. That is a terrible starting point, because it just doesn't have very much toughness, and 8 power for 9 mana isn't great either, even with Trample in the mix, but it does have another effect. It has Soul Shift 8, which means that when it dies, you can return a spirit with mana value 8 or less from your graveyard to your hand. So the body definitely has 2-for-1 potential, and while that's nice, the fact you have to fork over 9 mana for this thing really diminishes how good that actually is, especially because it's so mediocre at attacking and blocking for a creature that costs this much. So it isn't going to feel like you're producing a good 2-for-1 most of the time. It'll feel like you're playing a really expensive, super subpar creature that can only get you back something super specific when it dies. I mean, even if this let you return any permanent when it died, it still wouldn't be good, and this demands spirits in particular. And while that's obviously doable in a spirit deck, this isn't exactly the payoff you're looking for in those, as evidenced by the small number of EDH decks that this is played in, despite the fact that spirit decks are fairly popular. This just doesn't do enough for 9 mana. At number 6, it's Teeka's Dragon. I'm pretty sure this one's going to cause an uproar in the comments. For 9 generic mana, it's a 5/5 with Flying and Trample. That is terrible, but at least it also comes with Rampage 4, thank goodness. Unfortunately for this dragon though, Rampage is a famously bad mechanic because it almost never triggers. Rampage is an effect that only triggers when a creature is blocked by more than one creature, and it gets a buff based on the numerical value of Rampage, so in this case, it gets +4/+4 for each creature to block it beyond the first. Problem is, as a creature with flying, it's almost never going to be blocked by more than one creature, and it isn't like your opponent will need to. They'll have much more powerful stuff in play by the time you're both producing so much mana, and they can easily either deal with the dragon or block it with their own much better flyer. It's a shame because a really high Rampage value and Trample have some potential to work really well together. Like if you used a Lure effect to force blocks on a creature with Rampage 4 and Trample, you can wreck your opponent's world. Problem is, flying makes it hard for that to ever happen, and even then the whole Lure effect thing makes it highly situational to begin with, and the dragon doesn't work well with it anyway because of flying. Mostly you're just spending 9 mana on a 5/5 with Flying and Trample, and that is a horrendous investment. At number 5, it's Colossus of Sardia. For 9 generic mana, it's a 9/9 with Trample, which sounds better than everything we've seen so far, but the Colossus has a serious problem. It doesn't untap during your untap step. You can pay 9 generic mana to untap it, but only during your upkeep. One of the few things that can save creatures like this one, who refuse to untap unless you pay a cost, is that you can turn that downside into a bit of upside, because it means you can untap it at instant speed and block stuff, or have pseudo-vigilance if you have the mana around, but the Colossus doesn't let you do it since you can only activate the ability during your upkeep. So while the Colossus seems more efficient at first than Teeka's Dragon and the like, you quickly end up forking over insane amounts of mana just for this to continue to be able to attack, and God forbid your opponent kills it after you sink 9 mana into it to untap it. Basically, spending all that mana on this 9/9 Trampler is a pretty good way to lose a game of Magic. At number 4, it's Iname as 1. For 8 generic, 2 black, and 2 green, that's 12 total mana, it's an 8/8, but it does have an interest trigger and a death trigger. When it enters, if you cast it from your hand, you tutor up a spirit and put it onto the battlefield, and when it dies, you can exile it and return a spirit permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. The text box here is actually kind of nice, and this is some real 3-for-1 potential, but there are a few things really holding Iname back. The first of these is simply the absurd mana cost it asks you for. And while sometimes a creature with this insane of a mana value is worth cheating into play, Iname isn't, because they made it so that you have to cast it from your hand in order to get that enters trigger. I can see why they did it to an extent. They didn't want to make it a completely absurd reanimation target that grabbed another absurd spirit, but the mana value is just so extreme that only letting you get the effect when you cast it from your hand is a massive downside. It does still reanimate a spirit when it dies, regardless of how it was put into play, so at least there's that, but this card needs to be way more powerful if it's going to cost this much mana, and not work when you reanimate it or put it into play with Oath of Druids. Like I mentioned with Body of Jukai, lots of people play spirit decks in Commander, but in spite of that fact, hardly anyone uses Iname as 1, especially as a commander, and that's because, again, that interest trigger won't work when you cast it from the command zone. Commander wasn't really on Wizards of the Coast's radar back in 2005, so that's definitely an unintended consequence of how its interest trigger works, but still, that's a real shame because it's a cool card, but they designed a virtually unplayable one in the end. At number 3, it's Thing from the Deep. For 6 generic and 3 blue, it's a 9/9. Already, that's a card you're not that excited about, but that's all the more true because the text box here is pure downside. When it attacks, you sacrifice it unless you sacrifice an island. While it's admittedly not an absolutely massive downside, the fact you fork over 9 mana for a creature that isn't even that good at attacking and blocking, and then have to give up lands if you ever want to attack with it is super annoying. While it has better stats than lots of cards we've seen, at least most of the other cards have some upside. This doesn't have any. At number 2, it's Polar Kraken. For 8 generic and 3 blue, it's an 11/11 trampler, so at least it can end games in a couple of swings on an empty board, right? But after trample, everything else the Kraken has going on is pure downside. First, it enters tapped, and that's absolutely miserable when you're spending this much mana. The creature you play for 11 mana should be able to block when it comes down. But nope, for your opponent's turn, it's basically like you didn't add to the board at all. On top of that, the Kraken also has cumulative upkeep, sacrifice a land. This means on your upkeep you put an age counter on it, and then pay the upkeep cost for each age counter on the creature. So it gobbles up 1 land, and then 2, and then 3, and it quickly cripples your mana base. With all of that in mind, they should have made this creature even more impressive, especially because it still dies to tons of very cheap removal. Basically, when you play Polar Kraken, you time walk yourself, then you hand your opponent a good way to blow up your lands, and if the Kraken ever becomes a real threat, and that's a big if by the later stages of the game, they can just deal with it after it's done more harm than good. Kind of like Iname, the way this is designed also makes it hard to get it into play ahead of schedule, since you'll have even fewer lands to give up before losing the Kraken entirely if you put it into play early. However, even though this card's really bad, there is one super expensive creature that I think is even worse, and it's a fellow sea monster, and that card is, of course, Leviathan. For 5 generic and 5 blue, it's a 10/10 trampler, but like Polar Kraken, it enters tapped. And like Colossus of Sardia, it can only untap during your upkeep, in this case by making you give up 2 islands. Then anytime it attacks, you also have to give up 2 islands. Basically, Leviathan is even hungrier for your lands than Polar Kraken is, at least at first, and it has the same problem where it can cripple your mana base while not paying you off in a big enough way for spending so much freaking mana on it. Despite being bad, this is one of the cards I think a lot of us millennial Magic players thought was really cool when we were kids, because it has super cool art and it was the biggest creature we had ever seen, but we all quickly learned that it was in fact a terrible card when we tried to play it. So terrible in fact that I think it's still the worst 9+ mana creature ever printed. So, those are Magic's worst expensive creatures. If you'd like to spend a ton of mana on these terrible cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to catch up on other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.